Hector Berlioz, A Romantic Tragedy, by Herbert Francis Peyser. Foreword. A thumbnail sketch like the present is, of course, the last place in the world to recount even an infinitesimal part of a life so vivid and crowded with bitter conflict and tragic experience as that of Hector Berlioz; and the person who attempts it is beaten in advance. Moreover, such an effort seems almost gratuitous. For Berlioz has told his own story better than anyone else could possibly do it. When Ernest Newman was asked at one time to write a new biography of the epoch-making composer, he informed the publisher who suggested it that "no life by any other hands will ever be able to bear comparison as a piece of literature with Berlioz's autobiography. All others are for the most part a watering down into the author's inferior style of the sparkling prose of Berlioz himself." How much more futile is it to attempt on the minuscule scale of the following tiny, if rambling, pamphlet to touch upon even a thousandth of those achievements and unremitting conflicts which entered into the texture of this master's agitated and inharmonious life. Actually, it aims to do no more than contribute a mite toward a larger interest in the writings and the great mass of insufficiently discovered compositions of a romanticist whose labors are still surprisingly unrecognized art works of the future. H.F.P. End of foreword. "No doubt I deserve to go to hell," said Berlioz once to a friend who had reproached him for his treatment of Henrietta Smithson, his first wife. "But what would you have? I am in hell already." It was not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. Berlioz was in hell the greater part of his life. Of all the great composers he was perhaps the most consistently wretched. Misery and frustration pursued him from his youth to his grave. Time and again his existence seemed like the fulfillment of a curse. Actually, his mother had called one down upon him at the very beginning of his career, and for the rest of his days it appeared to work itself out implacably. One might even believe the malediction had retained its power beyond the tomb. For the posthumous glory of Berlioz is by no means unchallenged. Almost alone among the masters, he does not command anything like universal admiration, let alone affection. He has his redoubtable champions, and they include many of the greatest musicians, living and dead. But where Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Schubert, Brahms, Wagner need no defense, Berlioz incontestably does. Rightly or wrongly, he continues to be a problem, with all that this condition implies. Yet without him music could not conceivably be just what it is. And perhaps the strangest aspect of the paradox is that only a limited portion of his output enjoys anything like what might be called frequent hearing. The greater part of his greatest works remains to all intents undiscovered, nay, unsuspected by the multitude. The little mountain town, La Côte Saint-André, where Louis Hector Berlioz was born on December 11, 1803, had briefly been called La Côte Bonne during the Revolution and the Reign of Terror, when saints, for a while, went out of fashion. It was not far from Grenoble on one side, or from Lyon on another. The Berlioz family originated in Savoy, and can be traced back to the 16th century. Hector's father, Louis Berlioz, a doctor and a property owner, had at one time been mayor of La Côte Saint-André. In 1802 he had married Marie Antoinette Josephine Marmion, a good-looking woman, religious to the point of bigotry. Hector was the oldest of 6 children, 2 of whom died at an early age. The surviving daughters, Nancy and Adèle, were followed as late as 1820 by a son, Prosper, a problem child in the truest sense of the term, vague and unmanageable up to the time of a belated adolescence, then developing into a mathematical genius and dying in his 20th year before people had ceased to marvel at his talents. Hector's father supervised his early education, though it was probably as a concession to his wife that he placed the youngster in the local Catholic seminary. The boy did not stay there long, even if his mother harbored ambitions of making a saint of him. For a time he went uncomplainingly to mass, communion, confession, and the rest. In his memoirs Hector tells us details of his weekly confessions, when he would say to the director of his conscience, "My father, I have done nothing," and that worthy would reply, "Go on, my child, as you have begun," and so he did, for several years at least. Yet his mother's religiosity was to have the effect of turning Hector's thought away from the Church and toward the great figures of classical mythology. He felt his heart throb and his voice quiver and break when he construed the fourth book of Virgil's Aeneid to his father; and when the good man tactfully cut the lesson short, Hector was intensely grateful to him for taking no notice of my emotion, and rushed away to vent my Virgilian grief in solitude. Mythology was not the only love with which his father filled him. Under the paternal guidance he developed an interest in geography, and stories of travel helped fire his imagination. From an early age Hector had shown a sensitiveness to musical impressions, and besides learning to sing at sight, acquired some proficiency in playing the flute and the flageolet, though I was 12 before the magic of music was revealed to me. Presently he added to his musical accomplishments the playing of the guitar. The piano he never apparently undertook to master; but in later years he made a virtue of necessity, and insisted he was glad to compose silently and freely without having to depend on the keyboard. With harmony it was rather different, and after an unsuccessful start with Rameau's treatise on the subject, even in a simplified form, he had recourse to a textbook by Catel in order to pick up some elementary principles. These he presently put to use in a 6-part potpourri on a collection of Italian airs, and in the composition of a couple of quintets for flute and strings. The first was played by some local amateurs, and aroused the enthusiasm of all the hearers except Hector's father. Dr. Berlioz preferred as much of the later quintet as his son was able to play him on the flute, but the piece being much more difficult, the amateur executants who tried it quickly suffered shipwreck. The composer eventually burned both scores, yet salvaged a theme his father had liked, and then used it in his overture Les Francs Juges. Simultaneously with these hit-or-miss musical studies, the boy's emotional life was heightened at about this time by an incipient love affair, if one can call it so. Hector's relatives, the Marmions, had a country house near Grenoble in the village of Mailan, where he spent his vacations. Not far away, in a white cottage surrounded by vineyards and gardens, there lived with her mother and sister a tall and exceedingly pretty girl of 18, Estelle Duboeuf. At a family garden party to which Hector and his relations had been invited, Estelle picked him for her partner in some game. Poor Hector was conquered in the twinkling of an eye. When a few minutes later he caught sight of Estelle dancing with his uncle Marmion, who had been a soldier in Napoleon's armies and cut a superb figure in his gaudy uniform and clanking spurs, the boy flew into a jealous rage, only to have the whole party laugh at him. But Estelle, his Stella Montis, his Star of the Mountain, remained enshrined in his memory for life. Their ways were to separate, and they lost track of each other for years. A haggard old man, racked and buffeted by numberless woes and disappointments, he found her again and sought solace, vainly as it proved, in an attempt to recapture the shadow of a childhood fancy. His reward was a polite note, signed Estelle Fournier, her married name, and a conventional affectionate greetings, into which he chose to read meanings that the old lady never remotely intended. Hector's parents determined he should follow in his father's footsteps and become a physician. The idea revolted him, and he struggled against it much as Schumann combated his mother's wish to make a jurist of a youth with the soul of a poet. Nevertheless, he made as if to comply with the parental will, though one can guess with how many unspoken reservations. And so in the autumn of 1821 he set off for Paris to study medicine. But what fascinated him there were the theaters, the opera houses, the concert halls. things which up to that time he had never enjoyed the opportunity of visiting; and not the loathsome hospitals, anatomical amphitheatres, dissecting rooms, and other nauseating horrors. He had felt all along that he was never intended to spend his life at the bedside of sick people, in hospitals and dissecting chambers. His father had made the cardinal mistake of using his love of music as a lever for removing his childish aversion to embark on the study of medicine, and as a reward for working earnestly at osteology had given his refractory son nothing less to the purpose than a splendid flute with all the new keys. In Paris Hector lost no time visiting the Opéra, the Théâtre Italien, the Théâtre Feydeau, the Ambigu Comique. He heard Salieri's Danaides, Boieldieu's Voitures Versées, Telerec's Nina. Above all, he heard Gluck's Iphigénie en Tauride, and this masterpiece definitely settled the question. His life would be dedicated to music, and medicine could go hang. Berlioz, the scarlet romanticist, was born at the moment he solemnly made this resolve. It was farewell henceforth to the human charnel house, littered with fragments of limbs, ghastly faces, and cloven heads, where swarms of sparrows fought for scraps, and rats in the corners gnawed human vertebrae. He had, to be sure, grown somewhat hardened after his first appalling impression, and had even gotten so far as to cast a shoulder blade to a great rat which was staring at me with famished eyes. But the physical reactions he experienced to the music he loved attracted him in the same degree as the horrid displays of the hospital laboratories revolted him. In the theatre, listening to Gluck and Spontini, his knees would tremble convulsively, his teeth would chatter, he suffered with dizzy spells till he could not stand unsupported, he was bathed in sweat, his scalp contracted, tears choked him, he lost all sensation in fingers and toes, he was seized with chills and hot flashes. If this was not actually a type of celestial intoxication, it was probably a romantic imagination conveyed through the empurpled diction of the hour. Down at his home in the Dauphiné, Dr. Berlioz gradually got wind of what was happening and endeavored to reason with his son. The latter was frequenting the library of the Conservatoire, voraciously devouring the scores of Gluck, and leaving to those who had a taste for that sort of thing the sanguinary details of the anatomical chamber. And not only did he study the music of Gluck, Méhul, and others, but he addressed himself to the first two symphonies of Beethoven, at that time as good as unknown in Paris. In the Conservatoire library he met a certain Hyacinthe Christophe Hieronymo, a pupil of Lesueur, who counseled Hector to study with his affable old master, at one time a great favorite. Lesueur received Hector amiably at the first visit, examined a few compositions of the young man, pronounced them faulty, but urged him to undertake some preparatory studies under Gerono, a task he willingly accepted. In a short time Gerono indoctrinated him so thoroughly in Lesueur's harmonic system that the latter cordially took him as a pupil. Not that Hector accepted his mentor's teaching without many unspoken questions, but he quickly decided that the most diplomatic thing to do was to curb whatever impatience he felt and listen in silence. He had already written a choral work, Le Passage de la Mer Rouge, and a mass, and though they were youthful attempts and obviously unripe, he found it possible to dispense with conventional rules. And now he felt moved to attempt an opera. The obliging Gerono supplied him with a libretto, and the fruit of this collaboration was called Estelle et Némorin, Estelle de Boeuf doubtless floating before his mind's eye. Berlioz admits that the music was feeble, and called the entire work wishy-washy. As for the Mass, composed by request for the feast day of the choir children of the Church of Saint Roch, portions of it met the approval of Lesueur. When it came to paying the cost of its performance, Hector was in a quandary about raising the necessary 1,200 francs. Finally he borrowed the sum from a friend, Augustin Dupont, a step he was presently to regret, though Pons had lent him the money with the best of intentions. The Mass itself was praised, and some years later was repeated at the church of St. Eustache. By this time, however, the composer had become dissatisfied with the work, and then burned it together with several juvenile effusions. Meanwhile he had a stormy first meeting with Cherubini, head of the Conservatoire, and he failed to pass a preliminary examination for that august school. Hearing of this misfortune, Dr. Berlioz, usually slow to wrath, lost his temper and resolved to stop his son's allowance. If anything, Lesueur aggravated the situation by attempting to intercede on his pupil's behalf. Hector was summoned home and ordered to renounce his ideas of a musical career and take up some other occupation. In spite of the chilling reception the young black sheep encountered there, he was astonished and delighted to learn a few days later that the good doctor had once more reconsidered. "After several sleepless nights I have made up my mind," he gravely told his son. "You shall go to Paris and study music, but only for a time. If after further trials you fail, you will, I am sure, acknowledge that I have done what was right, and you will choose some other career. You know what I think of second-rate poets. Second-rate artists are no better, and it would be a deep sorrow and profound humiliation to me to see you numbered among these useless members of society." And he swore the youth to secrecy, but the news leaked out, and before Hector could take his place in the stage-coach, his mother, blazing with anger, confronted him with flashing eyes and exciting gestures. "Your father," she exclaimed, "has been weak enough to allow you to return to Paris and to encourage your mad, wicked plans. But I will not have this guilt on my soul, and once and for all I forbid your departure. I beseech you not to persist in your folly. See, I, your mother, kneel to you and beg you humbly to renounce it." And when the appalled Hector begged her to rise, she defied him wildly. "No, I will kneel." "So, wretched boy, you refuse? You can stand unmoved with your mother kneeling at your feet? Well, then, go. Go and wallow in the filth of Paris. Sully your name and kill your father and me with sorrow and shame. I will not re-enter this house till you have left it. You are my son no longer. I curse you." Hector had to leave, as he says, without bidding her good-bye, without another word or a look, and with her curse on my head. Back in Paris his first object was to repay Pons part of the money he owed him for the performance of the St. Roch Mass. He earned a few francs by giving occasional lessons in singing and by teaching flute and guitar. His monthly allowance amounted only to 120 francs, so the repayment was a slow and painful business. Most unhappily, Pons, wishing to spare Hector this continuous drain on his purse, resolved to help his friend by writing Dr. Berlioz and asking him to settle the remainder of the debt. Pons got his money, but poor Hector lost his allowance. Somehow he managed to scrape along. He had a tiny room, 5 flights up in the Cité, at the corner of the Quai des Orfèvres and the Rue de Harlay. He gave up dining in restaurants and confined his diet to dry bread and salt, with now and then raisins or dates. When the weather was favorable he took his meal on the Pont Neuf, beside the statue of Henri IV, watching the passers-by or gazing at the muddy waters of the Seine. He worked tirelessly at his music. Cherubini, now apparently mollified, put the youth into Reicha's class for counterpoint and fugue at the Conservatoire, even while he continued with Lesueur. Hector struck up a lifelong friendship with young Humbert Ferrand, who wrote him an opera book, Les Francs Juges, the Judges of the Secret Court, which he enthusiastically set to music, but of which only the overture remains. It is a fine thing of its type, bearing melodically, instrumentally, and harmonically the unmistakable imprint of Berlioz, even to the reminders of Gluck. One of its most striking themes survives from the boyish quintet of Hector's and anticipates in a fashion the idée fixe of the Symphonie Fantastique not very far ahead. Working on his opera, young Berlioz had somewhat neglected his flute and guitar pupils, and once more needed money. Even a franc a lesson would not help greatly when it became a question of winter clothes and firewood. Far from capitulating and returning beaten to Dauphiné, he first toyed with the idea of seeking a position as first or second flute in some orchestra in New York, Mexico, Sydney, or Calcutta, of becoming a sailor, filibuster, buccaneer, or savage in China, or attempting any other wild scheme, since it is futile and dangerous to thwart my will when I am resolved on anything. In the end he tried a safer, less exciting method. Aided by a streak of luck and an exceptionally good musical memory, he obtained an engagement as a chorus singer at the Théâtre des Nouveautés, where basses were wanted, but where a passable baritone could also be of use. By singing as a trial piece a recitative from Sacchini's Oedipe, he prevailed over a weaver, a blacksmith, an actor, and a choir member from Saint-Eustache. The job paid him 50 francs a month. Hector had not only to sing all manner of rubbish, but the colossal manager, Mr. Saint-Léger, sometimes obliged him to be the rear leg of an artificial camel. Even so, it was luck of a sort. At the same time 2 new pupils applied for lessons, and he met Antoine Chabanel, a young man from La Côte Saint-André, whose father had often scandalized Madame Berlioz because, being a tireless woman-chaser, he flew in the face of her family's ancient motto, "Respectability above everything." Chabanel, a budding pharmacist, found it advisable to share economics with Hector, and the pair set up bachelor quarters in 2 little rooms in the Rue de la Harpe. Chabanel cooked and Hector marketed, grossly violating the hygienic codes of his friend by carrying the day's provisions unwrapped under his arm. Hector calls the Franc Juge overture his first grand instrumental work. It was soon followed by another overture, Waverley. He was, he tells us, so ignorant of the mechanism of certain instruments at that period that he had written the trombone solo in the earlier score in the key of D flat, uncertain whether this choice of tonality was a wise one or not. On submitting the passage to a trombone player at the Opéra, he was delighted to learn that it was the best possible key for the purpose, and that the solo in question could not fail to produce a powerful effect. Greatly elated, he walked home as in a dream, and was recalled to himself by suddenly spraining his ankle. From that moment he could never hear the piece without experiencing a sharp pain in his foot. Perhaps, he muses in his memoirs, it gives others a pain in their heads. Curiously enough, neither Reicha nor Lesueur taught him anything about instrumentation. Thanks to a friend at the Opéra he obtained free tickets, and by close listening at such performances and study of such scores as were given, he perceived the subtle connection between musical expression and the special art of instrumentation, which no one had actually pointed out to me. It was by studying the method of Beethoven, Weber and Spontini, by an impartial examination of the regular forms of instrumentation and of unusual forms and combinations, partly by listening to artists and getting them to make experiments for me on their instruments, and partly by instinct, that I acquired what knowledge I possess, and was later to disseminate in his great treatise on instrumentation, subsequently modernized by Richard Strauss. Hector was officially admitted to the Conservatoire when, the next examination period having come round, he succeeded at last in passing the test. He was less fortunate with an orchestral scène on the death of Orpheus, which the students were required to compose, though Berlioz ascribed his failure to the incompetence of a mediocre pianist obliged to play the reduction of the original score. He had obtained a brief leave from his duties at the Théâtre des Nouveautés when he came down with a dangerous attack of quinsy sore throat. Alone one night and on the point of strangling, he suddenly sat down before his shaving mirror, seized a penknife and, in a paroxysm of agony, lanced the obstruction which was suffocating him. By some miracle he was on his feet again in a few days, and had the satisfaction of hearing from his suddenly repentant father that his allowance was to be restored. Having no further need of continuing his chorister chores, he was now free to devote his evenings to opera performances. These evenings, he declares, were solemn occasions. They could be tumultuous ones as well, for Hector was violent when matters outraged him, and as often as not became an irrepressible claqueur. More than once he had helped precipitate riots in the theatre. When at a performance of Iphigénie en Tauride, for instance, cymbals were introduced into a ballet passage where Gluck had only strings, and when trombones were omitted from a passage in Orestes' third act recitative, Hector could suddenly shout with all his might, "There are no cymbals there, and who has dared to correct Gluck?" Then in an Orestes passage, "Not a sign of a trombone! It is intolerable!" Again, during a performance of Dalirac's Nina, Berlioz missed a violin solo scheduled to be played by the violinist Berlioz. Just as the cue for the expected solo was reached, a furious voice was heard to exclaim, "So far, so good, but where is the violin solo?" "Very true," cried someone else. "It looks as if they were going to leave it out. Baio, Baio, the violin solo!" The pit took fire, the entire house rose, and loudly demanded that the program should be carried out according to schedule. Before long people dashed into the orchestra, overturning chairs and music desks, smashing the kettle drums. Meanwhile Hector, who had sown the wind, tried to control the whirlwind with sarcastic protest. "Gentlemen, don't smash the instruments! What vandalism! Don't you see you are destroying Father Chenie's beautiful double bass with its infernal tone?" But the mob was beyond control and broke not only instruments but innumerable seats and music stands as well. It was 1827, and he was beginning to harbor more far-darting ambitions. In June he planned to try for the Prix de Rome, though he really laid small value on the honor the winning of it conferred. How often was it no more than a means to an end? 3 times Berlioz competed, 4 if we count the preliminary test of 1826, in which he failed. But not until 1830 did he carry off the honor. In 1827 he had written for the purpose "L'Amour d'Orphée." In 1828 he gained the second prize. In 1829, when no prize was finally given, he turned out a Cléopâtre, which, had it been less audacious, might have won him the award, while in 1830 his cantata Sardanapale finally achieved the ultimate distinction. But this honor, so highly regarded among the rank and file of Frenchmen, was for Hector soon to turn to something like Dead Sea fruit. On September 11, 1827, Kemble's company from London inaugurated a Shakespearean season at the Odeon Theatre. Hamlet was the first offering, with the famous English actor in the title role. The Ophelia was Henrietta Smithson, tall, lithe, and Irish. All literary and artistic Paris was on hand. From the moment the daughter of Polonius stepped on the stage, Hector was lost. No thunderbolt could more completely have devastated him. When the performance ended, he rushed home, avoiding all acquaintances to whom he might have had to talk. Then he went out again and walked all night along the Seine, determined to wear himself out to obtain the temporary solace of sleep. It was useless. Next evening the visitors were giving Romeo and Juliet. Hector dashed to the Odeon early in the day and bought himself a ticket. To be sure, no unforeseen hitch might prevent him obtaining his usual admission. As he knew no word of English, he procured a translation and strove for a few hours to recreate in his mind a picture of Henrietta Smithson before again looking upon her in the flesh. If possible, the effect of the previous evening was intensified. He would now wander aimlessly through suburbs and countryside, sometimes even sleeping in open fields; or he would set to music Irish lyrics by Thomas Moore, or steep himself in more Shakespeare, dabble in Byron and Walter Scott, set about discovering Goethe and acquainting himself with Faust. He moved from the quarters of his friend Charbonnel and installed himself in a room in the Rue Richelieu directly opposite the house where Henrietta lived. He had never so much as exchanged a word with the actress, who, for her part, never yet dreamed that such a person as Hector Berlioz existed, let alone that he loved her wildly. None the less, Hector made a point of avoiding further Shakespeare performances, or so at least he claims in his Memoirs. "More experience of the kind would have killed me." But the inspiration of this Juliet and Ophelia, further enhanced by the romantic literature with which he was suffusing himself and the grandeur of those Beethoven works he was beginning to discover, were stimulating his creative fancy. He wrote overtures based on Waverley, King Lear, The Corsair. He wrote, in 1829, 8 scenes from Faust and a ballade of the King of Thule in Gothic style, things which were later to form the basis of La Damnation de Faust. He composed a set of 9 Irish songs. Above all, he wrote, and then revised, a work which was to become, in some respects, his most widely known and famous, the Symphonie Fantastique, a kind of symphonic phantasmagoria, with Henrietta as its chief motivation and himself as its chief actor. It was not till December, 1827, that the actress first had a fleeting glimpse of her worshipper. This happened quite by chance at a rehearsal for a benefit performance at the Opéra Comique, where Hector was to offer an overture of his and where some of the English actors were to perform a couple of Shakespearean scenes. By this time he had begun to write her letters, to which she never replied, for they frightened her, and she presently ordered her maid not to accept any more from the postman. When Berlioz, at a rehearsal, caught sight of Henrietta talking to her colleagues backstage, he muttered a loud cry and rushed from the theatre, wildly wringing his hands. Thinking she had to do with a madman, the actress begged her associates to watch him closely, for she did not like the look of his eyes. The mop of red hair that surmounted his head like an umbrella, his gaunt visage, fiery appearance, and generally hysterical demeanor must have given her reason for alarm, and she probably breathed more freely when she left Paris for Holland. End of Part 1. Everyone who has interested himself even slightly in Berlioz is doubtless familiar with the lurid fiction the composer invented to form the plot of the Fantastic Symphony. In this episode in the life of an artist, a high-strung youth is represented as seeking release from the torments of disappointed love by means of an overdose of opium. Instead of killing him, the drug afflicts him with a succession of perturbing, not to say terrifying, grotesque or macabre visions. Through each of them there moves the image of the beloved, musically represented by a recurrent string of notes, a sort of representative theme or idée fixe. The youth is a plaything of passions, reveries, jealousies, frenzies at the outset. Then he sees his idol, apparently indifferent to him, the central figure at a brilliant ball. Amorous thoughts mingle in his mind with dark presentiments as he wanders over the countryside, rendered more melancholy by the pipings on rustic instruments of 2 lovesick shepherds, till thunderclaps interrupt their mournful dialogue. Then he dreams he has murdered his beloved and is marched to the scaffold, after which his disembodied spirit becomes the sport of a noisome rout of demons, witches, succubi, and other infernal things, among whom the cherished one, now a devilish harridan, pursues him, while the Dies Irae sounds blasphemously in his ears. Doubtless much of the astounding score incorporates musical ideas originally conceived for other projected works. One way or another, the Fantastique is a formidable, if over-dimensioned monument of its period, and a landmark of history. With all its flamboyant and parodistic monstrosities, this fresco of psychopathic experience remains the first great and influential specimen of program music created in France, and it is no less amazing to reflect that the epical score came into being when its composer was but 27, and only at the time he was adjudged worthy of the Prix de Rome. Berlioz subsequently sent tickets for a performance of the symphony to Henrietta Smithson. She appears to have been about the only person in the hall unaware at that time that she was the heroine of the piece. More or less vaguely she had been hearing of the infatuation of her harassed admirer. Her reaction, lightly expressed, had been, "There could be nothing more impossible." It was not in Hector's nature to accept such a rejection as final. Still, she had unwittingly wounded him. For a while he decided that, with all her beauty and her gifts, she was no different from the average run of females. If she could think of repudiating his love, the fantastique was his derisive answer. This musical caricature of the actress he intended as a gesture of vengeance. The new symphony, however, helped gain him a friend and defender who was to remain one of his most valiant supporters for life, Franz Liszt. Liszt had met Hector shortly before and, transported by the symphony, he made a piano arrangement of it, which propagandized the work as, at the time, nothing else could have done. Scarcely liberated, as he thought, from Henrietta, Berlioz succumbed to another woman. This young person, decidedly no better than she should have been, was a friend of Ferdinand Hiller and a piano pupil of Kalkbrenner and Herz. Camille Moke set her nets for Hector and captured him without the slightest trouble. She came into his life at the worst possible moment. With the consent of her mother, briefly blinded by the young man's success in winning the Roman prize, Camille became engaged to her admirer, who was just about to set out for that sojourn in Rome which was the chief reward of a lucky contestant. He seems not to have foreseen trouble, though his sister, Nancy, was beset by premonitions; and Ferdinand Hiller sent to Berlioz in Rome the ironic message that his betrothed was bearing the separation with fortitude. Shocked, but still only half convinced, Hector took to bed and waited vainly for Camille's expected letters to Italy. Time passed and nothing came. Whatever interest he might have found in the Eternal City, where he had been warmly received by his fellow students at the Via Medici and by its director, Horace Vernet, he was unable to pay any attention to his work or his agreeable surroundings. Little really mattered, neither the monuments of Rome, the French Academy, his meeting with the well-graced youth, Felix Mendelssohn, his future prospects. Vernet, noticing Hector's worry, began to entertain serious misgivings. Summoning the newcomer, he warned him against any rash step. Finally, on Good Friday, the tormented lover impulsively left Rome, resolved to return to Paris and find out for himself what lay behind Camille's silence. In roundabout ways he got as far as Nice. On the journey he bought a pistol and some poison, determined to learn the truth and, if worst came to worst, to shoot Camille and then make an end of himself. He was not obliged to go to these spectacular extremes, for at long last he received a letter, not indeed from his presumable fiancée, but from her mother. That lady informed Hector that her daughter was on the point of marrying Mr. Pleyel, the famous piano manufacturer, and she requested her son-in-law not to kill himself. Of course he would kill himself, and the Mokes as well; but as he looked at the lovely Côte d'Azur landscape unrolled before him from the heights of the Grand Corniche, he suddenly experienced a revulsion of feeling. For the time being he would go on living. He dispatched a letter to Horace Vernet, inseparable from posts of influence, besides sapping his energies that should have been employed otherwise. Yet he knew how to draw profit from the means of publicity and power which his connections placed in his hands, and he did not hesitate to promote, as best possible, his personal interests. When their marriage was solemnized at the British Embassy, with Liszt as best man, Hector had exactly 200 francs and Harriet a mountain of debts. For their honeymoon they could travel no further than the suburb of Vincennes. The wedding trip, according to the groom, was a masterpiece of love. All the same, he soon had chances to notice that his bride was not in the least musical; likewise that she harbored a streak of jealousy. Not even the birth of their son, Louis, on August 15, 1834, at their home on the hill of Montmartre, helped soothe this unhappy state of affairs, which was to deepen as time went on. Harriet grew violently opposed to her husband's traveling, though Berlioz claims that a mad and for some time an absolutely groundless jealousy was at the bottom of it. Was it absolutely groundless? The composer's intimate associate, Ernest Legouvé, has let us into many secrets about the rift in The Lute in his book, Soixante Ans de Souvenirs. The blonde Irishwoman, some years older than her husband, was gradually losing her looks, her failures as an actress had for some time increasingly embittered her, and she presently took to drink. The more the sentiments of the formerly so ardent Hector changed to a correct and calm good fellowship, says Legouvé, the more his wife became imperious in her exigencies and indulged in violent recriminations that were unfortunately justified. Berlioz, whose position as critic and as composer producing his own works made the theatre his real world, found there occasions for lapses that would have proved too much for stronger heads than his. Moreover, his reputation as a misunderstood great artist endowed him with a halo that easily tempted his female interpreters to become his consolers. Madame Berlioz searched his feuilletons for hints of his infidelities, and not only there. Fragments of intercepted letters, drawers indiscreetly opened, brought her revelations just sufficient to make her beside herself without more than half illuminating her. Her jealousy was always outdistanced by the facts. Berlioz's heart went so fast that she could not keep pace with it. When, after so much research, she lighted upon some object of his passion, that particular passion was no more. And then, it being easy for him to prove his innocence at the moment, the poor woman was as abashed as a dog which, after having followed a track for half an hour, arrives at the lair only to find the quarry already gone. Yet the jealous instincts of the once lovely Ophelia and Juliet were, in fact, only too sound; and if her shrewishness increased by leaps and bounds, she had no little cause for it. Hector's friends seemed perhaps a little less devoted to him since his marriage, and since his miseries were a trifle less spectacular than they had been during his bachelor days; but these comrades included not a few personages illustrious in their respective spheres. Among them were the musical chroniclers Janin and d'Ortigue, the essayist and novelist Legouvé, Eugène Sue, Alexandre Dumas, Sainte-Beuve, Victor Hugo. Among the creative and performing musicians, Liszt, of course, and Chopin, who, though personally the antithesis of Berlioz, never wavered in his faithfulness to the man. And further, flashing like a comet across the firmament of Hector, there was the demon fiddler, Paganini. In 1834 Berlioz composed the descriptive symphony, Harold in Italy, in which Byron's child Harold, the central figure of the work, was represented by a viola solo. Whether Hector's account of the genesis of the composition is wholly authentic or not, the tale he relates in his Memoirs runs somewhat as follows. Having heard the Symphonie Fantastique one day, Paganini came to see the composer, and told him that he owned a wonderful Stradivari viola which he would love to play in public, though he had no music for it which he considered suitable. Would Hector write him such a work? He had no confidence in anyone else. The only thing the violinist insisted upon was that he must be playing the whole time. The work should not be an ordinary concerto, but rather something along the lines of the Fantastique. After much doubts and hesitations, the composer produced a series of scenes for orchestra, the pictorial background of which was shaped out of Hector's recollections of his Italian wanderings. while the viola strain, representing Byron's Dreamer, was added to the rest of the orchestral texture with which it contrasts both in movement and character, without hindering the development. Paganini did not hear the symphony till some time after it had been first performed, for he had been south, vainly seeking relief from that cancer of the larynx which had robbed him of his voice and was shortly to prove fatal. At the close of the work he ordered his son to tell the composer he had never in his life been so impressed at a concert, and were he to follow his inclination he would go down on his knees to thank him. And then, in full view of the audience, the great violinist did just that, and kissed Hector's hand. Next day he received a letter in Paganini's writing which ran: "Beethoven is dead and Berlioz alone can revive him. I have heard your divine compositions, so worthy of your genius, and beg you to accept in token of my homage 20,000 francs." Almost on the heels of this windfall Berlioz had the additional luck of being commissioned by the government to compose a requiem for an official ceremony. The work is one of his most monumental, one might say apocalyptic, even if the quality of its musical inspiration may be open to question. One thing, however, is certain: nothing he ever wrote is so overwhelming in point of sheer sonority as the appalling Tuba Mirum, with its 5 orchestras, its 16 kettledrums, and its phalanxes of trombones. At the climax of this fresco of the Last Judgment one of the participating singers succumbed in public to a shrieking frenzy of nervous prostration. There was talk in governmental circles of purchasing the Requiem, of a grand decoration, of a professorship at the Conservatoire, of a generous pension from the Beaux Arts Ministry. Nothing came of all these plans. As far as the Conservatoire post was concerned, Berlioz was rejected as teacher of harmony at that institution on the ground that he could not play piano, which was as true as it was irrelevant. But a far greater and more fateful disappointment lay ahead. Early in 1838 his mother, who had cursed him, died at La Côte Saint-André. Her curse did not perish with her. In fact, it smote him soon afterward when his lyric drama Benvenuto Cellini failed grievously at the Opéra, where after long and torturing efforts he at length managed to have it performed. Not even today can it be said to have gained anything like a permanent foothold on the stage. As time went on Hector tried to master his inhospitable fate in the operatic theatre by various compromises and subterfuges. He sought to create a dramatic symphony based on Romeo and Juliet, and neither outright drama nor outright symphony, which accounts for its infrequent performance, despite the extraordinary beauty of some of its music. He wrote a concert opera, which is, in effect, a cantata masquerading as an opera, and vice versa. La Damnation de Faust, one of the 3 most essential capturings in music of Goethe's Faust drama, was at its first hearing in 1846 possibly the most distressful defeats he ever suffered at the hands of his countrymen. Not until decades after his death did he enjoy a kind of posthumous revenge when Raoul Gunsberg in Monte Carlo fashioned a stage production which is now one of the mainstays of the Paris Opéra. A destiny in some respects even more deplorable was that of his music drama Les Troyens, which he was never to hear in its completeness. The one theatre work of Berlioz to enjoy something like an uncontested triumph at its launching was his 2-act opera comique Béatrice et Bénédict, for which Shakespeare provided the original incentive. As for Romeo et Juliet, its high points are found in 2 movements: the rapturous love scene, which includes the most enamoring melodic lines Berlioz ever conceived, and the unparagoned Queen Mab scherzo, embodying the composer's instrumental fantasy at its most subtle and ravishing, even if Parisian criticism of the time could see no more in it than a little noise like that of an ill-greased syringe. That long-scheduled visit to Germany continued to be deferred. Meantime Berlioz had been appointed assistant librarian at the Paris Conservatoire, a small distinction to be sure, but offering at any rate a few additional francs. A more ponderable achievement was the composition for band of a 3-movement symphonie funèbre et triomphale, planned for performance in the open air in memory of those fallen at the Revolution of 1830. The Funeral and Triumphal Symphony was one of the first compositions of Berlioz which Wagner heard when he arrived in Paris in 1840. Wagner was struck by the nobility of the work, ranked it among the loftiest achievements of its composer, and retained an undissembled admiration for it all his days. Berlioz had reason to believe that after this official labor he might be called to step into the shoes of Cherubini at the Conservatoire, when that worthy went to his reward in 1842. But the choice fell upon Georges Onslow, and Hector, realizing that if he was ever to obtain in Paris the distinction to which he felt himself entitled, he would have to enhance his French reputation by properly publicized successes abroad. So he began by giving several concerts in Brussels, the second of which was destined to be important, less so for musical reasons than because of domestic entanglements it initiated. Knowing Harriet's jealousy, Hector seems to have been strangely incautious about keeping secret the identity of his traveling companion. It did not take his alternately maudlin and assiduous Irish wife many days to find out from the papers that a certain Marie Recio was the snake in the grass. The Recio was a second-rate singer whose real name was Marie Geneviève Martin. Hector had met her in 1841. We are told that she rekindled in his heart those romantic emotions the now slatternly and alcoholic Harriet could no longer feed. Marie's mother encouraged the liaison because she realized the power Berlioz had come to be in the journalistic field. He had been so imprudent as to impose her on one operatic management, and the game had turned out badly. Before long, poor Hector found himself as luckless in his second love affair as he had been in his first. End of Part 2. The various tours which Hector undertook in Germany brought him artistic honors and material successes of which in France he had never dreamed. Among average audiences he discovered a seriousness and a degree of taste such as were limited to a few circles at home. He refashioned old musical friendships and cultivated new ones. Mendelssohn met him in Leipzig, and the pair continued the old artistic discussions and arguments as they had years before in Rome. Felix was charming, fascinating, ceaselessly obliging, and determined to be a guarantee for his French colleague's success. The two exchanged batons to symbolize their professional amity. Felix praised some of Hector's songs, but avoided saying a word about his symphonies, overtures, or the Requiem. Actually, he detested them. Berlioz saw Robert and Clara Schumann. The former appeared wholly electrified by the offertory of my Requiem. The Schumanns were hospitality itself, even if Clara sometimes found the Frenchman cold, indifferent, morose, and not the kind of artist I like. Robert, however, feels a sympathy for him which I cannot explain. Mendelssohn privately confessed that he felt like washing his hands after he had been through a Berlioz score. In Dresden there was Richard Wagner, whose Rienzi and Flying Dutchman Hector listened to with interest, and who turned himself inside out to assist the extraordinary visitor in training orchestra and chorus for his concert in that city. One thing astonished Berlioz, and grew to be something of a fly in the German ointment: that worship of Bach with which he was surrounded. People do not believe that this divinity can ever be subjected to question, he sighed. Heresy on the subject is forbidden. Bach is Bach, just as God is God. On these travels, which went on intermittently for years, Hector visited not only Germany, but also Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, Russia. He went to Russia in 1847 and later. There he was greeted like a conqueror, and more than any other nation that country proved materially a gold mine to him. A pity that the harsh climate of places like St. Petersburg was, in the end, to try him so sorely. For whenever he went there he was literally overwhelmed with honors, decorations, costly gifts. In short, whenever neglect or disappointment became unbearable, he could turn to Russia for at least temporary alleviation. In Vienna, 1845, he found much to delight him. To be sure, he was often painfully struck by many things, such as the lamentable ignorance prevailing with respect to the works of Gluck. He was in the habit of asking musicians if they knew Alceste or Iphigenia, and invariably he received the answer, "They are never performed in Vienna. We do not know them." Whereupon his mental reaction would be, "But, you wretched creatures, whether they are performed or not, you ought to know them by heart." On the other hand, he heard numbers of remarkable artists, and admits he would have to write a book to do justice to each and to catalogue all the musical wealth of Vienna in detail. He received, naturally, the usual silver baton inscribed with the titles of his works; also a little present of 100 ducats from the Emperor after one of his concerts in the Redouten Saal; and from the same exalted source the message conveyed by the imperial master of ceremonies, "Tell Berlioz that I was greatly amused." Meanwhile the composer had been working by fits and starts on the Damnation of Faust. He wrote page after page of it at the most unbelievable times of day and night, and in the unlikeliest places: on the Boulevard Poissonnière, on a stone of the Boulevard du Temple, in the park at Enghien, when in a somnambulistic trance he had boarded a suburban train and it had simply deposited him there; at Lille, at Rouen, in Passau, in Prague, in Silesia; while walking, while eating, while traveling. When he left Vienna for Budapest he prepared to perform at his first Hungarian concert the Rakoczy March, of which he had made what in effect has long been the standardized and most overpowering orchestration of all. This national melody invariably drove Magyar listeners into frenzies of patriotic enthusiasm (for that matter few audiences even now can hear it unstirred), and on the program piloted by Berlioz it led to such a wild demonstration that, as he directed it, the composer's hair stood on end and he was seized for a few moments with a kind of nightmare terror. He thereupon introduced the march into the score of the Damnation and placed the opening scene of the Faust action in Hungary so as to motivate the presence in the score of the volcanic page. It is hard to grasp today that the first performance of the Damnation of Faust at the Paris Opéra Comique, December 6, 1846, was the most heartbreaking fiasco of Berlioz's life. It was not a question of violent opposition (if only it had been), but of abysmal, devastating indifference. Only a scattering of friends occupied the first rows of the Salle Favart, with further back a handful of cynical faces. Otherwise an inhuman emptiness sat enthroned in the gaping theatre. The comic journal Charivari sniggered that if the Song of the Rat went unnoticed it was because there was not so much as a cat in the house. From the outset Berlioz knew himself ruined materially and spiritually. It was less the few remaining francs saved on his travels which mattered than the irreparable hurt done the morale of the afflicted man. "Nothing in my artistic career wounded me more deeply than this unexpected indifference," he was to write in his Memoirs, lapsing for once into pitiful understatement. Not until 1877 was the Damnation of Faust revived in Paris, by which time the composer had been dead 8 years. Although Berlioz recouped some of his financial losses from the Faust misadventure when he went to Russia the following year, he was the plaything of destiny once again when, late in 1847, he accepted an invitation from Louis Antoine Jullien to go to London and conduct opera at the Drury Lane Theatre, of which Jullien was then the manager. This spectacular French adventurer and charlatan, who speculated ruinously, went to jail for debt and died in a lunatic asylum, failed shortly after Berlioz suffered himself to be inveigled into what he thought would be a 6 years' engagement, and the composer, after giving a few concerts of his own music, found himself back in Paris by July, 1848. But England saw him again in 1851–52, when the new Philharmonic Society of London secured him as conductor, and in 1855 when he occupied the same post, not to mention a visit 2 years earlier when he was lured across the Channel to witness a Covent Garden representation of his first opera, Benvenuto Cellini. This turned out almost as distressingly as had in Paris The Damnation of Faust. It is one of the real misfortunes of musical history that Hector Berlioz and Richard Wagner never became to each other the kinsmen and spiritual brothers they should have been. Some unhappy flaw in their respective natures always thwarted a consummation which, one feels, fate should have preordained, or some barrier sprang up between them precisely at the moment they should best have complemented each other. They had, in the larger sense, the same ideals, the same luminous visions, the same majestic aims, the same reluctance to palter and to compromise. They were both tortured by nerves and exacerbated by futile suspicions and jealousies. Yet each had the true measure of the other's importance, whether admitted or not. Prejudices and preconceptions, sometimes artificially fostered, if not fed by envy or rankling disappointment, had a way of cropping up to blind them as soon as they gave promise of seeing eye to eye. Wagner was the stronger of the two, not only as to creative power but in toughness of fiber. But if they were not equally matched, the differences and asperities of the one fitted perfectly into the natural flaws and crudities of the other, as Wagner himself once took occasion to point out. Berlioz appears to have recognized in Wagner, much as he may have resented it, a force of the future which sooner or later must challenge him. All the same, it is wrong to imagine that Wagner underrated his French rival, however he discerned the weaknesses of his work. His appreciation of the artist Berlioz was broader and more fundamental than the appreciation of Berlioz for him, which was so often soured by jealousy and blinded by bias. Wagner was incontestably sincere when he wrote, "We must honor Berlioz as the true renewer of modern music." Too few people are familiar with that extraordinary episode in Bayreuth, long after the Frenchman's death, when the aging Wagner flew into a towering rage on hearing the still youthful Felix Mottl criticize some detail of a Berlioz work. "When a master like Berlioz writes something, you are too shallow to grasp your duty is to accept it without question or murmur," he had screamed at his astonished disciple. Only once did the pair draw close enough to justify the belief that they might have developed, under more hospitable circumstances, a lasting friendship. This was in 1855, when the two men, in the depths of discouragement, met in London, whither Wagner had come to conduct the old Philharmonic. The improved relations were only temporary. The creator of Tristan appreciated that the jealous Marie Riccio stood in the way of any lasting rapprochement. And he confided to Liszt that a malicious wife can ruin a brilliant man, and bring out the worst aspects of his character. Indeed, I have sometimes to wonder if God would not have done better to have left women out of the scheme of creation. In 1861, at the Tannhäuser fiasco at the Paris Opera, Berlioz played a part that reflects eternal discredit on his memory, even if the shabby treatment he so often endured at the hands of his countrymen could account for his spitefulness. The domestic situation of Berlioz had hopelessly deteriorated. Harriet, lame, coarse, shrewish, had lost the last vestiges of her once admired beauty and talent. She was in due course to suffer paralytic strokes and then to become bedridden. Her son Louis, having grown to young manhood, became an aspirant mariner at Le Havre and decided to follow the sea, inheriting an early but unfulfilled ambition of his father. A true sailor, he had a wife in every port, and Hector, who was aware of the wanderer's inclinations, sometimes longed to meet those grandchildren of his he knew lived scattered through the hemispheres. Now and then Louis would return briefly to Paris and look in on his wretched mother at her little house on the hill of Montmartre. Occasionally he would seek out his father at his domicile near the Place Pigalle, though only when Marie Recio was out. The moment he heard her footsteps in the hall he would flee. He could not pardon his father, and he said so unmistakably. So did others. To all reproaches the unhappy composer had only one helpless answer: "What would you? I love her." Yet if that far-off adoration of his Ophelia and Juliet had apparently long since turned to ashes, something like retribution was to overtake him. For years he had been paying her routine visits, understanding her solitude even as she divined his misery. But early in March, 1854, he was called to her bedside and found her dying. At that he was not even granted the wretched solace of receiving her last breath. Harriet expired a few moments after he had left the house on some trivial errand. The blow was far more terrible than Hector had thought possible. In a flash he recognized that he really loved the wife more than he did the mistress, and in prodigious rebellion he cursed that stupid God, atrocious in his infinite indifference. To his son he wrote, "You will never know what your mother and I suffered because of each other, and it was these sufferings which brought us so close together. It was as impossible for me to live with her as without her." He was to see her once again. 10 years later they exhumed her, and in Hector's presence placed her ghastly remains in a new coffin, and reinterred them in the Montmartre cemetery. In October, 1854, Berlioz legalized the situation of Marie Recio by marrying her. More wanderings lay ahead of him. He could have gone to New York, had he so chosen, and conducted concerts there. Rightly or wrongly, he declined the offer. But in 1855 he harvested rich honors at a Berlioz festival which his untiring champion Liszt staged in Weimar. A work which greatly stirred the audience at the Weimar Court Theater was the newly composed L'Enfance du Christ. This exquisite legend, as simple, transparent, and unpretentious as most of his other works are huge in scale and demanding, is a delicate little trilogy divided into sections respectively called Herod's Dream, The Flight to Egypt, and The Arrival in Sèze. It looked for a while like a turn in Hector's fortunes. Almost wherever the oratorio was performed it met with a favor to which the composer was quite unaccustomed. In Paris there actually were ovations, and the press spoke of a masterpiece. Berlioz was aware that Wagner, slowly but surely, was elaborating his gigantic Nibelungen project, and he too became gradually filled with a scheme for a mythological opera. His old love for Virgil's gods and heroes, dating back to the days of his boyhood and his Latin readings in his father's library, reasserted itself. He dreamed of a vast fresco in which the siege of Troy, Aeneas, Hector, Priam, Cassandra, Dido, and the rest of the splendid personages of the Mediterranean world should be combined in the action of a great lyric tragedy, carried out in the Shakespearean manner. But though the idea fired him, it also terrified him as he thought of the giant efforts it involved and the disappointments it was sure to entail. He confided his ambitions and his fears to Liszt's friend, the Princess Caroline Sayn Wittgenstein. It was she who spurred him to the task and overrode his doubts and scruples. "You must create this opera, this lyric poem, or whatever you choose to call it," the Princess insisted, and as he continued to plead the troubles it meant, she silenced him with a pretended severity. "Listen! If you shun the sufferings which this labor may, and indeed ought, to cause you, if you are so weak as to be afraid of it, if you refuse to dare everything for the sake of Dido and Cassandra, then stay away from me. I never want to see you again." It was a liberating word, and Berlioz returned to Paris for the heartbreaking business of writing poem and music. He had foreseen its pains and obstacles only too clearly, but he wrestled furiously with them and kept the oath he had given. Sombre and lonely, he composed, revised, expanded, cut down, suppressed and altered in 1,000 different ways. The epic seemed to be taking all sorts of impractical forms, and the composer realized that even all the conventional devices of dramaturgy might not avail to fit it for the theatre. 2 years of intensive work brought the end of the score in 1858. Meanwhile Berlioz had terminated his Memoirs, which he kept at the Conservatoire out of fear that his second wife, in the course of her often indiscreet searchings, might light upon some secrets he preferred to hide. In the end he confided the manuscript to Liszt, to thwart Marie's curiosity if he were to die. For Hector had been much haunted by thoughts of death as the time went by. Years of disappointment were more and more taking toll of his nervous system. He was tortured by what the doctors called intestinal neuralgia, against which medicine appeared to be unavailing. Les Troyens was in many ways the supreme blow of his life and more than anything else his child of sorrow. In the year of its completion he tried in vain to have it sung at the Opéra. 3 years later that institution accepted it but did not give it. Finally Léon Carvalho, manager of the Théâtre Lyrique, mounted it on November 4, 1863. The composer had found it necessary to divide his 6½-hour opera into 2 parts, La Prise de Troie et Le Troyen à Carthage, to make a performance possible at all. At that there were cuts, changes, revisions without end, and to this day versions and additions have been found indispensable if the work is to be made a practical stage piece. The first presentation did not include the Prix de Troie half, and this portion of the work, of which Cassandra, the composer's beloved heroic virgin, is the central figure, Berlioz was never to witness. In spite of innumerable difficulties and the unfinished state of the representation the piece was moderately successful at first, the reviews in the main favorable, the box office fair, and Hector himself delighted with as much of his creation as he heard. But the worries and tribulations the opera involved, for any change he wanted Hector had to pay out of his own pocket, brought a nervous breakdown, and he managed to attend no more than 4 performances. As soon as his back was turned, the management cut and slashed the score without compunction. By the end of a month audiences had fallen off to such an extent that before Christmas Les Troyens disappeared from the repertoire. This new blow promised to break the unhappy composer's spirit altogether. "My career is finished," he told someone who hoped for an early resumption of the work. "I have neither hopes, illusions nor great ideas left." He reflected bitterly. "My contempt for the stupidity and dishonesty of people has reached its peak." And when he was told that audiences were beginning to flock to hear some work of his, he would reply, "Yes, they are coming, but I am going." On June 14, 1862, Marie Recio died suddenly of a heart attack. The blow struck Hector much less violently than did the passing of his first wife. Possibly the circumstance that he was engaged on a new work at the time somewhat blunted the edge of his grief. This latest creation, his last as it proved, was the 2-act opera comique Béatrice et Bénédict, a lyric version of Much Ado About Nothing, given for the first time at the newly built Casino in Baden-Baden. Béatrice et Bénédict proved to be a repetition of the Enfance du Christ surprise, a brilliant success from the first. Berlioz was happy, but also cynical. "People are now discovering that I have melody, that I can be jubilant and even humorous," he wrote. Another triumph of the new work at Weimar in 1863 further demonstrated that the piece had been born under a lucky star. Like Verdi, 30 years later, Berlioz was disposed to conclude his creative career with a comedy inspired by his idolized Shakespeare. "I have written the final note with which I shall ever soil a scrap of music paper. No more of that. Othello's occupation's gone. I should like to have nothing more to do. Nothing, absolutely nothing." Actually he had much more to do: conducting, writing, traveling, suffering. Yet so far as making music was concerned he was finished. After Marie Recio's death Hector lived with his mother in law, whom he esteemed and who in turn loved him. Love of a different kind still lured him on. He met a young girl, by name Amélie, and felt a fresh upsurge of romantic passion. But in 6 months she too was dead. Meanwhile Berlioz and his son had drawn much closer together spiritually. Yet Louis was generally far from France, and the pair, though they corresponded, saw but little of each other. One evening a number of Hector's closest musical friends, angered by the persistent neglect of the composer by his own countrymen, staged a little private glorification in his honor. They waited for the guest of the occasion, and when time passed and he did not come, a messenger was sent to fetch him. Berlioz lay on the floor of his room, writhing in an agony of grief. He had just received word that Louis was dead in Havana. He was inspired by a sudden wish to renew one of the ties of his boyhood, and the thoughts of the eternal adolescent turned to Estelle de Boeuf, his Stella Montis of long ago. She was now a widowed old lady, patrician and proper, who had had a number of children, all of whom she had carefully reared and some of whom she had lost. She lived in Lyons, and to that city Hector presently turned his steps. Estelle Fornier, amazed by the unexpected visit and the importunities of her aging and weather-beaten guest, received him in kindly fashion, alluded tactfully to his agitated life, but with gentle firmness discouraged his pleas for a somewhat closer friendship. Nevertheless Berlioz was carried away by the mere joy of the meeting, and he chose to place an extravagant interpretation on a few commonplace phrases of hers and the words "affectionate sentiments" with which she had concluded a brief message. He continued from afar to worship this mirage and to build it up into elaborate fictions. He corresponded further with the decorous old lady, imagined vain things, and confided to the Princess Wittgenstein, "This kind of suffering is indispensable to me." Meanwhile he was off again on travels. In 1866 he conducted "La Damnation de Faust" in Vienna, and in 1867 led half a dozen concerts in St. Petersburg, where he made the acquaintance of Balakireff, Tschaikowsky, and other Russian musicians, till, unable to endure the rigors of that climate, he returned to France, longing passionately for the sunshine and warmth of the Riviera. Walking on the beach at Monaco he suffered a bad fall, the consequence, it appears, of a slight stroke, which recurred a few days later. He rallied, however, though once back in Paris he found it necessary to spend long and dreary days in bed. He had made his will, leaving his books and scores to the Conservatoire, and distributing his meager fortune to his nieces, besides settling a sum of 1,800 francs on Estelle Fornier, which she is said to have declined, and providing a tiny income for his mother-in-law. Of his various crowns, laurel wreaths, and other trophies he made superb bonfire. "I feel that I am going to die," he wrote his Russian friend Vladimir Stasov. "I believe in nothing any more. I am exorbitantly bored. Farewell. Writing causes me no end of trouble." Gradually his faculties refused to function. Little by little his brain became clouded, his tongue thickened, he made no attempt to talk, and appeared to want nothing. On March 8, 1869, the long embattled and sword-tried fighter, who had never attained inner or outer harmony, found peace. A final touch of irony was provided by the fact that his graveside valedictory was spoken, in the name of the Conservatoire, by a certain Elwart, to whom Berlioz had once said, "If you are to make a speech at my funeral, I prefer not to die." End of Part 3. End of Hector Berlioz, A Romantic Tragedy. Herbert Francis Peyser.